Merry Christmas, YouTube. This is Jayvardy, and we're back with another video today. And going into the new year, going into the new decade, we are at the end of 2019. We're about to enter the 2020s. So today I want to talk about the top 10 decade-defining moments from 2010 to 2019. So this video, we're going to discuss world events from my point of view. It's a video talking about the decade-defining moments from my point of view, things that I will remember most from this decade regarding politics, sports, and movies. This isn't a personal list. This isn't going to me writing the top 10 decade-defining moments of my personal life. I could do a video like that, but this is going to be talking about politics, sports, and movies, and things that happened in the world during this decade that in the 2020s, in the 2030s, in the 2040s, I will look back and this is what I will remember from 2010 to 2019 the most. It's neutral. It's not saying these things are good. They're not saying it's bad. It's not saying I like that this happened. It's not saying that I dislike that it happened. It's specifically decade-defining moments. What is the 10 most memorable moments from 2010 to 2019 in the world of movies, in the world of sports, and in the world of politics? I am staying neutral. I'm not saying whether it's good or bad. You can make up your own mind, but I think you will agree that these 10 moments are probably the most memorable moments in those categories for the decade of 2010 to 2019. All right, let's talk about numbers 10, 9, 8, and 7. So, starting off this list, I'm a big hockey guy and I live in Toronto, Canada. And this was a really big deal when it happened. The Toronto Maple Leafs select Austin Matthews first overall at the NHL draft. The Toronto Maple Leafs were a really bad team for a really long time. They're getting a lot better now. They made the playoffs for a few years in a row, and this year they did fire Mike Babcock as their coach in 2019. And ever since that firing, the team has really turned itself around, turned its season around, and it does look like they will be a playoff team for a fourth year in a row. Before this decade, making the playoffs 4 years in a row, in the 2000s, from 2000 to 2009, the Leafs were a bad team, especially after the 2004 lockout. They didn't even make the playoffs for the rest of the decade after that lockout. And before they drafted Austin Matthews this decade, they only made the playoffs once. He was really, when they brought him in, that's when the team really turned the ship around and became a truly good team, and now they're a competitive team that should be contending for a Stanley Cup for the next while. If they don't win it this year, the Leafs will be a contending team in the 2020s. The Toronto Maple Leafs very well could win the Stanley Cup in the 2020s. They're not going to win it if they do win it this hockey season, it will officially be 2020 when they do win. So they didn't win the Stanley Cup this decade, but going into the 2020s, they have a really good chance. And one of the reasons, the main reason for that is because they got Austin Matthews first overall. Number 9, Joaquin Phoenix overtakes Heath Ledger as the best Joker we've ever gotten in the movies. Now, some people might not like hearing that, but in my opinion, Joaquin Phoenix really is a better Joker than Heath Ledger. The movie itself, The Joker, has grossed more at the box office than The Dark Knight did. And yeah, there's been some inflation over that time. The Dark Knight came out in 2008, The Joker came out in 2019. But keep in mind, The Joker did not have 3D screenings, much like The Dark Knight didn't have 3D screenings when it came out either. Ticket prices have gone up a bit in that time, but in all honesty, I think Joaquin Phoenix is a better Joker than Heath Ledger anyways, regardless of box office numbers or regardless of each film's success. Joaquin Phoenix was an awesome Joker. The Joker movie itself was the best movie I've seen in years, and he really has overtaken Heath Ledger as the main Joker in everybody's mind, at least for this decade. Heath Ledger was a great Joker, and for years and years, even into this decade, people would dress up like him for Halloween. He would be a very heavy cosplay item like throughout the year, but Joaquin Phoenix, at this point of time, at the end of 2019, he really is the Joker on everyone's mind, and he did eclipse Heath Ledger as the best Joker. And it is significant because there have been other attempts at doing that. Jared Leto did play the Joker this decade, and he failed to even compete with Heath Ledger. It wasn't even close. Suicide Squad didn't make nearly the amount of money that The Dark Knight did. It didn't get nearly the critical acclaim that The Dark Knight did. And nobody cosplayed or memed or anything Jared Leto even close to what they did for Heath Ledger. But Joaquin Phoenix, he really did get to that level that Heath got to, and in my opinion, overtake him. Number 8, Donald Trump becomes the first president to step into North Korea. So Donald Trump became the first sitting U.S. president to walk into the country of North Korea. I remember when I was a kid, I would read articles in the newspaper about how the next great war of my lifetime was going to be the U.S. and North Korea, and it could potentially be a nuclear war. And it's been something that's been on my mind ever since I was a young kid, that maybe the United States and North Korea could have like a nuclear fallout against one another. And that could still happen. Who knows? Who knows what's going to happen in the next decade? But for years and years, North Korea has been in the back of my mind. And the aggression of North Korea has been in the back of my mind. And the tense relationship between the United States and North Korea has been in the back of my mind. And the presidents of my lifetime, most specifically George Bush and Barack Obama, didn't do anything to ease the tensions with North Korea. They failed to have a connected relationship with the country of North Korea. Say what you want about Donald Trump. He has handled North Korea really well, and he will, in history, for the rest of time, he will always be the first president to ever step foot into North Korea. And he's met with Kim Jong-un several times. They do have a relationship. It is a strange relationship, and it's very weird. We know, like, it's very up and down, hot and cold, it seems, but it doesn't really matter because Donald Trump, without a shadow of a doubt, has done the most to build a bridge between the United States and North Korea, way more than George Bush did and way more than Barack Obama did. Number 8 for me is Donald Trump being the first president to step foot into North Korea. Number 7, Thanos' finger snap kills half the Avengers and half the universe. I talked about this in my top 10 comic book movies list of the decade. I did a video that's on my channel right now, the best comic book movies from 2010 to 2019. Avengers Infinity War was on that list. It wasn't number 1, but it was on the list. But what I did say about Avengers Infinity War is, out of all the movies on that list, the Thanos finger snap will be a moment remembered in cinematic history for the rest of time. And it was probably the most memorable movie moment there in a singular movie from this decade. This was by far the most memorable moment in a single movie for this decade. And it's one of the decade-defining moments, in my opinion. Number 7, Thanos' finger snap kills half the Avengers and half the universe. So let's talk about numbers 6 through 3. Okay, number 6, we have the people of UK vote to leave the EU plus Boris Johnson's election victory. Now, this is a major story because the United Kingdom is leaving the European Union, and the UK had a direct democracy vote about the situation. Now, direct democracy is when the people of the country as a whole, all the electorates of the country as a whole, vote on a matter instead of the representative government only voting on the matter. Normally in countries like the UK, the United States, Canada, where I live, and countries like that, they have representative democracy where you elect a government and then the government votes on matters. But every now and then you see these countries have what they call direct democracy, where they take a bill or an idea or a situation and the country as a whole votes on it. You saw this with the country of Ireland when they voted on gay marriage. The country of Ireland had a direct democracy where the entire country got to vote whether gay marriage should be legal or not. The same thing happened with the EU, and the United Kingdom voted with a 51.5% score to leave the European Union. And it took a couple years, and there was a lot of back and forth in the parliamentary system of the UK about whether or not it was going to happen, even though it was the country voted for it and they announced they were doing it. But then Boris Johnson was re-elected as Prime Minister of the UK. Now, when Boris Johnson first became the UK Prime Minister, he was elected by his party to be the leader. He wasn't elected by the electorate of the country to be the Prime Minister. But when the last election happened, he ran and he was re-elected by the actual electorate, and then he got a super majority. The election wasn't even close. Boris Johnson and the Conservative Party of the United Kingdom dominated the last election. They won the most seats. They won the popular vote. They won a super majority in Parliament. It wasn't even close. The election was a complete, huge victory for Boris Johnson, which confirmed the leaving of the EU by the United Kingdom. Brexit is officially happening. And this has been a major story for many years now in this decade, and it's officially happening after the people of the country voted by a score of 51.5% to leave, and Boris Johnson and the Conservative Party had a huge election victory in the United Kingdom. Brexit is officially happening. The UK is leaving the European Union. Number 5, and this might upset some people that this is higher than the Thanos thing, but like I said in my comic book movie video, I'm more of a DC fan, and Batman v Superman was a bigger deal to me than the Avengers was, and Batman, Superman, and Wonder Woman all appear in the same movie for the first time. It's crazy to think that these characters that have existed for decades, you know, we're talking the 50s, 60s, 70s, where these characters were created, respectively, where they weren't all created at the same time, but respectively in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, these characters were created. And they've been the face of DC for many, many years, long before even I was born. It's crazy to think that it took all the way until this decade, 2010 to 2019, for them to appear in the same motion picture for the first time, at least in live action form. We've had animated movies where they were all in it together, of course. But for live action, Batman, Superman, and Wonder Woman all appear in the same movie for the first time, and to me it was a really huge deal. I really liked the movie. I wish it was a little bit bigger than what it did, but to me it was a huge deal before it happened. It was a huge deal when it happened, and it's still a huge deal now after it happened. So for me, number 5, Batman, Superman, and Wonder Woman all appearing in the same movie. Number 4, and this will be the final movie moment of the decade, and that is the fall of Star Wars under Disney. Now, some people will say, oh, well, Star Wars is thriving under Disney. They're making billions and billions of dollars. Well, it depends on how you look at it. In terms of a normal movie franchise, of course Star Wars is doing well. All their movies are number 1 at the box office for at least the first 2 weeks. They make billions of dollars at the box office, and for the most part, the critics seem to give them pretty positive scores. But if you look at the trajectory, it's going down in both critic approval, fan approval, and box office. The Force Awakens made a ton of money. It made a ton of money overall and a ton of money opening weekend. You look at The Last Jedi, the next movie to come after Force Awakens. It made less money on the opening weekend, and it made less money in total at the box office. You look at Rise of Skywalker. It made even less money at the opening weekend at the box office, and it's projected to make even less money overall than The Last Jedi did. It's been a steady trajectory down in terms of box office for both opening weekend and overall dollars for the 3 movies. The same thing happened with their spin-offs. You went from Rogue One, which had a huge opening weekend and a really large overall gross. The next spin-off movie was Solo. It had a smaller opening weekend and a much, much smaller overall gross than Rogue One did. And then the next spin-off movie got canceled. It's not even going to happen. They canceled it because of the performance of Solo. So even with the spin-offs, the trajectory is going down. And the same thing, it's not just box office dollars, it's both critic ratings and fan ratings. Fan approval across the board is going in trajectory downwards for Disney Star Wars. Force Awakens had really high critic reviews and really high fan reviews. The hardcore fans, for the most part, were mixed, I would say, for The Force Awakens. The general public, for sure, The Force Awakens was loved, for sure. But for hardcore fans, I would say Force Awakens was mixed. It was passable, but like I personally didn't like it. I left the theater almost in tears that night. Well, not left the theater almost in tears. It was when I got home that I was almost in tears when I started really reflecting on the movie. Horrible night. I could barely sleep after thinking about that movie all night. But anyways, with hardcore fans, I think that movie was mixed, but it was passable, I would say, for the most part, because they were looking forward to what was next. Last Jedi, the critics score is not as high as Force Awakens was. The general view of the public was not as high as The Force Awakens was, and hardcore fans hated The Last Jedi. Absolutely hated The Last Jedi. And then Rise of Skywalker, it's gone, man. It's done. The critics hate the movie. The general public didn't show up, not to the levels that they did for the first two movies anyways. And hardcore fans hate this one even the most of all. So it's been nothing but a downwards trajectory for Star Wars under Disney. The hardcore fans are done with the franchise. I myself am pretty much done with the franchise too. It'll never be the same that it once was. In my opinion, Star Wars has really fallen under Disney, and one of the decade-defining moments for me, and coming in at number 4, is the fall of Star Wars under the ownership of Disney. Batteries died in the camera while I'm shooting a video. First world problems. So why don't we start number 3 over. Number 3, Prince William and Kate Middleton getting married. Now this was a massive story when it happened. Prince Harry also got married in this decade, and which was also a really huge story. But not to the level that this was. This has got to be the most famous wedding of all time. Prince William and Kate Middleton. I remember when I was a little kid and like knowing who Prince William was, and I live in Canada, which obviously the monarch is still technically the head of state here in Canada. So of course I know who Prince William was. My whole life I've known who Prince William was. But when he got married in 2011, it was such a huge story. I remember sitting at family Christmases and talking about the the engagement of Prince William and Kate Middleton. They got married in the month of April, so when we were talking about it, they were still engaged with the wedding having been announced. But it was front page of newspapers, front pages of magazines, and for the first couple years after the marriage, Kate Middleton was on the cover of virtually every celebrity magazine almost every single week, every single month. She became basically the most famous woman on the planet for at least a couple years. And the same thing happened with Harry's wife after he married her, but still not to the level of this. This is definitely one of the decade-defining moments of 2010 to 2019, for sure. Whether you're a fan of the royal family or not, this was everywhere. The whole world was talking about it. The whole world watched it, and one of the most memorable moments of 2010 to 2019, without a doubt, Prince William and Kate Middleton sealing the deal, tying the knot, getting married. So there you go. There's 10 through 3. Let's now get into the top 2. We're going to clear the board, and I'm going to talk about the 2 most memorable moments. Number 2 is more of a personal thing for me. But it's still a huge moment in the history of sports. And number 1 is without a shadow of a doubt, no matter who you are, we'll all agree on number 1 being the decade's most defining moment. So let's go. Let's talk about number 2 and number 1. So living in Canada, obviously hockey is my favorite sport. I grew up playing hockey. I grew up watching hockey. Still a huge fan of the sport today. And one of my favorite players of all time, not just this decade, but of all time, is Alex Ovechkin. And the Washington Capitals really did become my favorite team post-2004 NHL lockout. After the 2004 NHL lockout and the Matt Sundin era of the Toronto Maple Leafs was coming to an end, he only played for them 3 more years after that lockout. Sidney Crosby and Alex Ovechkin entered the league. And Alex Ovechkin was instantly my favorite player, other than Matt Sundin, when he entered the league, and obviously Matt retired not too long after that. But Alex Ovechkin was my guy right from the get-go, and I became a huge Capitals fan from the day he played his first game as for the Capitals. So number 2 for me, Alex Ovechkin and the Washington Capitals win their first Stanley Cup. So the Washington Capitals win their first Stanley Cup in franchise history with Alex Ovechkin as their captain, him of course winning his first Stanley Cup, and what a ride it was to get there. And that's why it's such a memorable moment for me, because when we talk about Alex Ovechkin and winning the Stanley Cup, it was different from how Sidney Crosby did it. Sidney Crosby won his first Stanley Cup in his 4th NHL season. It took him only 4 years to win a Stanley Cup. Alex Ovechkin, this is his 14th season, so it took him 12, because he won it 2 seasons ago. He won it in his 12th season as a player. It took him 3 times the amount of time that it took Sidney Crosby. And I'm not saying that to knock Alex Ovechkin. Hockey is a team sport. I am saying that it made the moment so much more memorable than when Sidney Crosby won his first Stanley Cup, because when Crosby won his first Stanley Cup, it was a sense of we knew it was coming and we knew there would be more to come. With Alex Ovechkin, there was some serious doubt about whether or not the Capitals would ever be able to win. And when they finally did, they did it on the shoulders of Alex Ovechkin. He won the Conn Smythe Trophy, he was the playoff MVP, and after 12 years of being the face of that franchise, being one of the greatest goal scorers in the history of the NHL, they finally got it done, and it was such an amazing moment. Without a doubt, the greatest hockey moment of the 2010 to 2019 decade. They might not have been the greatest team of the decade. They're definitely in the top 5 greatest teams of the decade. Chicago did win 3 Stanley Cups that decade. LA won a couple Stanley Cups. Pittsburgh won 2 Stanley Cups. But the Capitals, they're up there for the decade. But if we're talking about moments, the greatest moment of the decade for sure, Alex Ovechkin hoisting that Stanley Cup for the first time. Iconic. I'll remember it for the rest of my life. If I ever have kids or grandkids one day, I'll definitely, if they're hockey fans and we start talking about the old days, which is the current days now, definitely this will be a moment that we talk about for sure. Team Canada winning the gold medal at 2010. A lot of Canadians would put that as their number one moment of the decade, but for me, I'm a Capitals fan, I'm an Ovechkin fan, and it was 12 years in the making, and for sure this was a huge moment for the decade. I watched every single playoff game the Capitals played the year they won the Stanley Cup, and it was so much fun and so gratifying to see them finally get it done. For me, number 2 decade-defining moment, Alex Ovechkin and the Washington Capitals win the Stanley Cup. Now, you all know what number 1 is. Do I really need to write it down? I'll write it down. I'm going to erase this, I'm going to write it down, and we're going to talk about what you all know is the number 1 moment, so don't get upset. We all know what it is. Let's erase this and let's talk about it. So when you talk about a decade-defining moment, you have to look at 3 things. Number 1, the events that took place before the moment happened. Number 2, the moment itself. So the pre-moment, the moment itself, and of course number 3, the aftermath. So what happened in the world before this moment happened? What became of the world when the moment did happen, and what has happened since that moment has happened? When you look at those 3 things, in terms of, I'm a film guy, I work in the film industry, so pre-production, production, post-production. But in this sense, it's before, during, after, or pre, during, aftermath, however you want to say it. There's clearly one decade-defining moment that stands above everything else when you take into consideration what happened before, what happened during, and what has happened after. We all know it. This decade will always be defined by this. Number 1, Donald Trump is elected President of the United States, the 45th President of the United States. You look at what has happened in the world since, look at what has happened in the United States since, look at the moment itself, look at everything before, look at everything during, and look at everything after. There's a million things to talk about with this, but the point is, the number 1 decade-defining moment from 2010 to 2019, without a shadow of a doubt, is Donald Trump being elected President of the United States. However you feel about him as president, however you feel about, the Republicans, Democrats, whatever, your politics isn't the discussion here. It doesn't really matter what your views are. The most decade-defining moment is Donald Trump being elected President of the United States. Will he be reelected in 2020? It's up in the air right now. If I had to make an official prediction, I would say yes. I do think he's going to be reelected in 2020. But that's another discussion for another time. There's my top 10 list of decade-defining moments, 2010 to 2019. And if you skip to the end of the video to now, if you skipped to just this part, you can't see the whole list. I only have number 1 written here. You'll have to go to other parts of the video to see the rest of the list. But I do encourage you, if you did skip to the end just to see what was number 1, I do encourage you to look at the rest of the list and to listen to my explanation for each choice too, because if you don't understand why I place something in the list, maybe after hearing my explanation, you'll understand it better. And if you disagree with the order of the list, if you listen to my explanation, you also might understand the order of the list as well. So if you did just skip to the end, I do encourage you to check out the rest of the list. Regardless, leave a comment of your top 10 most memorable moments of the decade. Let me know what other future videos you want to see. Right now I have on my channel the top 10 comic book movies of the decade. I do encourage you to check that out if you're a fan of movies or comic book movies. More videos are to come, so please subscribe to this channel, youtube.com/Jayvardy. That's Jayvardy, youtube.com/Jayvardy. There you go, top 10 decade defining moments, 2010 to 2019. I'm Jayvardy. Thank you so much for watching this video. That is all for today.